Excellencies, distinguished participants, in my capacity as the OSCE Special Representative and Coordinator for combating trafficking in human beings, it is an honor for me to open this year's 18th Alliance Against Trafficking in Persons Conference and chair today's opening session. 15 years after the adoption of the OSCE Action Plan to combat trafficking in human beings, the Alliance Conference continues to deliver a broad and inclusive platform capable of addressing new and emerging trends of human trafficking. In recent years, we put a focus on topics such as child trafficking, trafficking for the purpose of forced criminality, and human trafficking along migration routes. Each of these areas represented particularly pressing forms of trafficking, for which I am proud to say the Alliance responded by developing concrete recommendations and effective joint strategies. Ladies and gentlemen, today, irrespective of age, sex, and nationality, men, women, and children will be trafficked and exploited in conditions amounting to modern slavery. You may not see them, but they are there. You may think this doesn't happen in your local city or province, but it does. No state, to my regret, can declare full eradication of trafficking in human beings. Trafficking does not recognize borders. According to ILO, which there are 25 million people were engaged in forced labor at any given time in 2016. Findings released by the Council of Europe this month suggest that the problem is going worse, with all countries evaluated by Greta indicating an upward trend in trafficking for labor exploitation. Trafficking for sexual exploitation also remains rampant, as evidenced by Europol's recent operations against trafficking in a human being, the largest ever carried out in Europe. In this instance, but many of victims were trafficked by voodoo threats before being kept in squalid conditions and exploited in prostitution to pay nearly 3,000 euros in debt they were told they owed to a transnational organized crime groups. Given the magnitude and complexity of these transnational trafficking challenges, we have gathered here today to discuss how we can foster more inclusive partnership to enhance the coherence of anti-trafficking efforts. After all, trafficking is a cross-dimensional and multi-layered crime which touches upon many areas, ranging from economic and social inclusion issues to medical assistance and ICT. Clearly, then any response should see partnerships which are just as cross-dimensional and inclusive. Currently, in many projects and initiatives, the OSCE seeks to partner at every opportunity with diverse actors in multidisciplinary, cross-sectoral, and transnational efforts, where inclusion, collaboration, and the sharing of best practices are watchwords in our efforts to ensure more effective investigations, timely prosecutions, and the prompt identification of victims. I am proud, for example, that my office was able to mobilize more than 300 individuals from local authorities, civil society networks, and partner international organizations to ensure the successful implementation of our simulation-based training to combat trafficking in human beings along migration routes. I am similarly pleased to say that over the course of 5 international workshops, our project to prevent trafficking in human beings in supply chains attracted over 350 experts ranging from governments, international organizations, the private sector and academia across 53 OSCE participating states and partners for cooperation. The utility of our model guidelines to prevent trafficking for labor exploitation reflects this broad input, as do many of our other publications and recommendations available here today. We hope that, as in previous years, our alliance will serve as a forum in which participants can analyze case studies and exchange good practices so as to realize and operationalize effective multi-stakeholder anti-trafficking partnerships. To this end, I am pleased that such a wide range of stakeholders have gathered here today. This is exactly the broad participatory approach which I believe will yield fruitful recommendations to enable international, non-governmental and intergovernmental organizations to join forces to better prevent and combat what is, make no mistake, one of the most lucrative criminal enterprises on the globe. Your Excellencies, before I introduce the conference agenda, please allow me to briefly present and pass the floor to each of our distinguished opening speakers. Firstly, I am pleased to welcome Vincenzo Amendola, Italian Undersecretary of State for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. I wish, first of all, to thank Italy for its contribution to my office's national and international capacity building live simulation exercises to combat human trafficking along migration routes, of which we will be hearing more about tomorrow. We look forward to continuing this excellent partnership. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here today with you, Special Representative Ambassador Jarbussynova, with Director Bekkers and Director of OSCE ODIHR, Gísladóttir. Yeah. I always make mistake, and she always is the second conference that I make mistake. And of course, with all the UN agency here represented, because we know that what we are discussing here in this 18 Alliance Against Trafficking in the Person conference means also an alliance that brings OSCE in the middle of a connection between the multilateral institutional, the frameworks that we know that are working all together to cover such a relevant issue, together with the NGO, in an alliance that has to be effective and has to tackle this, that is a modern slavery, as the Special Representative was mentioning in her speech. This issue is among the top priorities of the Italian 2018 OSCE Chairmanship, aimed at further developing the organization commitment in targeted fields. Lo dico innanzitutto.
I am saying this most especially to you, Ambassador, because in your comments you emphasized how strongly condemning and combating this phenomenon is a daily commitment. However, condemning it is not enough. It is also important to take an approach which is based on constant prevention and on the protection of victims and the most vulnerable. An approach that takes into account gender specificities and I'm thinking of the revolutionary nature of the 1125 resolution of the United Nations. The policy must also be one that pays attention to risks faced by minors and that considers the link that can be created between conflict situations and crises and the emergence of trafficking in human beings. So we find ourselves faced with the need to implement UN resolutions, the OSCE mandate, and those of all institutions, which shouldn't be talking about an emergency, but rather about a phenomenon that touches entire societies on every continent. I believe that the OSCE to be among the best suited organizations to highlight the complex cross-dimensional nature of this threat, as well as to put in place a response that allows us to unite the policies of participating states with the intervention of the OSCE presence on the ground. And most importantly, with the initiative of civil society and non-governmental organizations, which often have an ability to detect the emergence of the phenomenon even more rapidly and with greater reactivity than can state institutions. It is for this that I believe it's particularly important and constructive when I note the topic chosen for this edition of the 18th Alliance Conference, and we will support the OSCE increasingly as an entity that is able to bring together the actors, states, NGOs, in the multilateral partnership that is necessary in order for us to be able to provide solutions, and most especially that help us to have a new perspective on the phenomenon. So let me repeat that we're not talking about an emergency. What we're talking about is the emergence of connections between societies and continents faced with new risks and old and new conflicts that lead to a situation in which we must, in a multidimensional manner, move beyond this concept of emergency. This is the approach which in Italy we have adopted in recent years as we experiment and build a new approach and search for new forms of cooperation between the state and civil society in a difficult period for our country and for the European Union. Our goal is to create a structural relationship between Europe and Africa, between Europe and Asia, to create a connection between continents. Today, we know that our model is one of needing to counter criminal networks with programs that help victims, that provide for their assistance and integration, and that protects victims, as well as provides for opportunities for them to enter the world of work. Our national plan from 2016 to 2018 is coordinated by an entity that includes all actors. And the Italian government has set up a special fund that is financing not only the social integration programs and assistant programs, but also programs for host centers and welcome centers. The increased trust in the response of the government and the growing effectiveness of our policies have allowed for us to free more than 25,000 people who were victims of trafficking in human beings in 2017. This is also thanks to targeted campaigns to raise awareness in society. We find ourselves facing a new reality on our borders, on the borders of continents. And we also find ourselves in a situation in which we can develop together new approaches together with the OSCE and the United Nations and its specialized agencies. As I refer specifically to the United Nations High Commission on Refugees in fighting this new form of slavery. With the adoption of resolutions 2331 and 2388, the United Nations Security Council has demonstrated its decisiveness, and with the decision 717 of the Ministerial Council of the OSCE in Vienna, the OSCE has demonstrated that it has picked up this signal. We are now creating new laws on a global scale in order to counter trafficking in human beings. And we are now targeting the link between criminal networks and trafficking in human beings, as well as the links with certain forms of discrimination. It is the ability of multilateral institutions today to strengthen their own approaches and efforts in this area means that we are all taking a leap in quality in the way that we counter these phenomena. Dear Ambassador, we have chosen to dedicate the first supplementary meeting in the human dimension, which will be held in Vienna 28th and 29th May of this year, to the topic of preventing and countering trafficking in minors. This also in light of Italian legislation approved 1 year ago to provide a right in this area.
As I mentioned, with the UN resolution and the UN agency working nowadays, especially on the route between Europe and Africa, we can push our alliance to new target and new goal. In this particular historical period, even because of the massive migration, that I repeat once again, is not an emergency, but is a structural relation among the continent, the OSCE and this capability to be at the forefront, at the hub of connection among geographical areas, there are more than a possibility for us. Children, above all, are our goal in terms of commitment. But even women, as I mentioned with the resolution 1125, and men who are becoming more vulnerable face the phenomenon of human trafficking. I'm deeply convinced that the OSCE will have a pivotal role in protecting those people and promoting effective policy of prevention. In this framework, I just want to reaffirm our engagement in order to reinforce the role of the organization in this sector on an issue that will be at the center of the discussion at the next Ministerial Council that will be held next December in Milan. Thank you once again. Thank you for this alliance to all the subjects that are strengthening OSCE, but also are strengthening our fight for liberation from this new slavery. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Undersecretary Amendola. And I would like to take this opportunity to express my personal gratitude to Italy and the 2018 Italian chairmanship team for picking up this topic as the priority. So for having a strong emphasis on combating trafficking in human beings. And I wish also to thank the Italian chairmanship for generously sponsoring this evening's networking cocktail, where I hope to see all of you after the end of our first panel. Our next speaker is very familiar with the OSCE anti-trafficking efforts and indeed with attempts to build result-oriented partnerships across all three OSCE dimensions in general. It's my pleasure to give the floor to Paul Bekkers, Director of the Office of the Secretary General, who will speak also on behalf of the Secretary General, Thomas Greminger. Paul, please.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, dear Madina. It's an honor for me to join you at the annual conference of the Alliance Against Trafficking in Persons, and I do so at the same time conveying warm regards from Secretary General Greminger, who is currently in New York. Warm regards to all of you. And I would also like to thank the OSCE Special Representative, Ambassador Jarbussynova, for bringing together all of you. An inspiring group of policymakers, experts, and practitioners from the participating states and partners for cooperation in order to discuss means of enhancing our individual and joint responses to trafficking in human beings. And the presence of Director Gísladóttir and the co-panelists, the directors of the UN and the Special Envoy Cochetel, they exemplify that there is a common goal for increased partnerships at regional and global levels. And a special welcome, if you allow me, to the keynote speaker, Ms. Monica Villa, CEO of the Thomson Reuters Foundation, who can count among her many achievements, I thought I should mention that, the Champions for Change Award for her efforts in the fight against human trafficking. We are delighted to have you among us, Ms. Villa, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts on the role of the media can play in raising badly needed awareness of the challenge we face today. Ladies and gentlemen, trafficking in human beings not only poses a serious challenge to the security of our societies, it represents a heinous, gross violation of fundamental rights and freedoms. As Ambassador Jarbussynova mentioned, it preys on human vulnerabilities. It has infiltrated the public and private sectors and regularly manifests itself in all too many families, communities, and countries globally. This is the 15th conference of the Alliance. That's a good thing. It shows how important it is, how much appreciated it is, but it's also a sad thing. Things are not getting better. Far from that. It was mentioned by my honorable two speakers on the left and the right-hand side, by Deputy Minister as well. This horrible crime is penetrating our societies. Every day the media alert us about some new incident. And just last night I heard on the radio a fragment of a recording when 3 girls were literally sold. Bluntly, unashamed. And somehow we seem to get used to this modern slavery. And we shouldn't get used, because it's a horrible thing. So we should ask ourselves a question, whether we are doing the right thing. And are we doing the things in the right way? I don't know if I can answer that question, but I'd like to point out 2 elements. It's clear that the role played by the OSCE in this struggle is important, and the Deputy Minister clearly alluded to that. And today, the next couple of days, we will hear insights about the dedicated efforts from the special representatives, but also from various units and departments in the Secretariat and institutions, as well as from our field operations. A second point on this. The OSCE work in this area dates back since 1999. It had also led to the 2013 addendum to the OSCE Action Plan to combat trafficking in human beings. And I think it's a very important document. The document is of particular relevance for today's event, since it not only helps states addressing trafficking in human beings, but also deals heavily with the topic of partnerships. In particular, it states that, and I quote, while the primary responsibility for combating and preventing trafficking in human beings rests with participating states, the link of this phenomenon to transnational organized crime, and here the crux is, requires cooperation at the international and regional level involving the private sector and relevant NGOs. So when answering the question, are we doing the right things or are we doing the things right, it's obvious we need partnerships. Clearly, trafficking in human beings cannot be effectively handled by any state, organization, or any agency on its own. A collective effort is needed based on shared understanding and values, on joint analysis, on planning, on concrete action, and on appropriate monitoring. To quote Winston Churchill on this, if we are together, nothing is impossible. If we are divided, we fail. A little sidestep. This conclusion, this observation, is another illustration for the priorities in the OSCE reform agenda. You might have heard of it. The OSCE's reform agenda aims to make the OSCE fit for purpose. And we're aiming, it's one of the priorities, to leverage pragmatic and results-oriented partnerships, including with relevant international organizations, like we see today, with development actors and the private sector. And I wish to highlight here the recently signed joint action plan with Unodc. Mr. Brandolino is here, in which combating trafficking in human beings is featured as one of our key areas of cooperation. In conclusion, strengthening inclusive dialogue and joint action among participating states and engaging more actively with parliamentarians, with civil society and the public are key elements for the future. I think this alliance in person serves as a good example of this vision. And I trust, I hope, I believe that the presentations and discussions that will take place in the next 2 days will result in meaningful recommendations aimed at ensuring the vigorous implementation of OSCE anti-trafficking commitments. And hopefully it answers the question whether we are doing the right things and are we doing these things the right way. Thank you. I wish you a very good and fruitful conference.
Thank you, Paul. I am also certain that improved partnerships will be instrumental in the OSCE Secretary General's aspiration to enhance the OSCE's fit-for-purpose reform agenda and in maximizing the organization's effectiveness moving forward. Our next speaker is doubtless familiar to many of you present today, with over 35 years of experience, leadership experience on human rights, democratic governance, and the rule of law at the international, national, and local levels. I'm pleased to pass the floor to Ingibjörg Gísladóttir, Director of the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights.
Thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, let me thank the Office of the Special Representative and specifically Ambassador Jarbussynova for organizing the annual Alliance Against Trafficking in Human Beings conference. The event has become an important forum for exchange, cooperation, and coordination on the topic across the OSCE region. Before I continue, I would like to remind us all why we are here today. We are here today to ensure that no woman, man, or child, like the survivors whose faces you see now in the photographs here, remain vulnerable to or fall prey to traffickers in the future. The survivors, the victims, have human faces, and it's important that we remember who we are working for. The theme of this year's conference, Everyone Has a Role, How to Make a Difference Together, strongly resonates with ODIHR's multidimensional and multidisciplinary approach at the core of ODIHR's National Referral Mechanism Handbook. This handbook is utilized not just within the OSCE region, but also globally to structure national anti-trafficking frameworks. We are now working on the update of this handbook, and I can promise you that the multidimensional and multidisciplinary approach will be reinforced in the updated handbook, with the addition of the perspectives of key stakeholders, that is to say, of the survivors of trafficking in human beings. In this regard, I would like to share with you a short video clip from a side event that we, our ODIHR, co-organized with UN Women, with Unodc and civil society organizations at the 62nd meeting of the Commission on the Status of Women, CSW, last month, on the theme or under the slogan, Me Too, Say Survivors, Human Rights, Gender and Trafficking in Human Beings. This was a very powerful and emotional, I must say, meeting where survivors' perspectives were central throughout the discussion. And now you will see a video clip if this works.
My name is Chandra Waruntu. I'm a woman. I am a survivor of sex trafficking and domestic violence, and I am me too. When I was trafficked, I was abused, sexually harassed, sexually abused all the time. 120 to 350 US dollar every 45 minutes. They took my dignity and freedom.
I have always had the most enormous admiration for survivors of sexual trafficking and sexual exploitation, for their bravery in coming forward.
Exploited persons are largely women, marginalized, economically disadvantaged, and most often women of color.
We used to work from 7 in the evening till 7 in the morning. It didn't matter how you feel, it didn't matter who you are.
I regret that I don't see more men in this room listening to the three of you.
The Me Too movement must include sexual trafficking and sexual exploitation and prostitution as one of its core violations that it talks about.
There needs to be an investment on promoting, women's economic empowerment and financial empowerment so that women are equal to men.
We must deal with the demand that fuels systems of exploitation. It's that money.
So when we sit here making laws and policy, can we think about every day? Can we think about the young girl that gets taken or forced or manipulated?
And that has to stop. We have to lift up every member of this human race.
We can speak out. We can speak out and we can get engaged. And this is important because I think one of the most threatening parts of society today is indifference. We cannot be indifferent. We have to take a stand. Well, thank you. ODIHR has been committed to working with our partners in the Alliance to strengthen the effectiveness of participating states' efforts in preventing and combating trafficking in human beings. ODIHR has been at the forefront of tackling trafficking in human beings since 1999 and has focused on human rights standards in response to trafficking. As a result, ODIHR has developed significant expertise and a prominent role in the domain of victim protection and the promotion of the rights of trafficked persons and at-risk groups. We hope we will continue paving the way for the interventions of various anti-trafficking actors in the OSCE and beyond. Our efforts to combat trafficking in human beings cannot be effective without ensuring a human rights-based and gender-sensitive approach, and doing so with every consideration for the best interest of the survivor in mind. Finally, I would like to highlight the key strategic approaches for the ODIHR's anti-trafficking portfolio, which remain, firstly, applying a multidimensional and multidisciplinary human rights-based and victim-centered approach to trafficking. Secondly, building on the expertise and tools previously developed by ODIHR. And thirdly, seeking and strengthening partnership built around complementary strengths and synergies. And allow me at the end to reiterate the Ministerial Council Decision 617, which recognizes the importance of the voice of victims of human trafficking in elaborating effective anti-trafficking strategies. I would like to take a moment and recognize a powerful survivor leader amongst us, Rachel Moran. She was sitting here somewhere with us. Oh, there she is. Yeah. Her contribution to the ODIHR SPMU site event earlier today serves as an inspiration to all of us to refocus our efforts, but to do so inclusive of the survivor perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingibjörg, for once again highlighting the ODIHRs, which are actually the OC's approach to human trafficking, which is on the basis of the respect to a human being. And building upon our joint initiatives of our officers in the human dimension in recent months, I look forward to the developing continued closer practical ties with your office, which will let us move forward. Our next address comes from a man who has devoted his career to the issues of human rights, equality, and social justice. While unfortunately unable to attend us today, Deputy Executive Director of UN Women, Yannick Glemarec, has nonetheless very kindly provided us with a video address.
Your Excellency, Secretary General of OSCE, Mr. Thomas Greminger, distinguished members of the Alliance Against Trafficking in Person, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of UN Women, I'm extremely grateful for these invitations to say a few words at the opening of the 18th conference of the Alliance. 3 years ago, the international community agreed to the 2030 agenda. For the first time, the world has a common plan for humankind, people, planet, and prosperity. The imperative to fight against trafficking in persons is fully embedded into the 2030 agenda with at least 3 direct indicators. Target 5.2 for the Sustainable Development Goal on gender equality and women empowerment, target 8.7 in terms of sustainable growth, and target 16.2 for peace and security. Unfortunately, we are very unlikely to achieve the 2030 agenda by 2030, based on existing trends. It will take at least 50 years before we reach parity in terms of women participation in politics at the parliamentarian level. It might take 80 to 100 years before every single girl, even from the most poorest background, can complete secondary education. And according to some estimates, we might have to wait 75 years before we achieve equal pay between women and men. Why is it a major issue for the objective of eliminating trafficking against persons? Trafficking against persons is a highly engendered issue. The 2016 Unodc reports estimated that up to 71% of the persons trafficked were actually women and girls, and that they accounted for up to 96% of those trafficked for the purpose of sexual exploitation. And we know that we will not be able to come up with an effective prevention strategy if we do not address the root causes of the vulnerability of women and girls to trafficking, and notably the fact that they have limited access to productive assets and to the labor market, that they face constraint in terms of achieving an education, that in most countries in the world, we still have rules that either intentionally or unintentionally discriminate against women. So we need to address all these root causes to ensure that the objective of the Alliance, which is to prevent to prevent trafficking in person, are achieved. Does it mean that we have to admit defeats because based on existing trends, we are not to achieve the 2030 agenda by 2030? Absolutely not. History shows that the global trends are not a curse, they are not a fatality, that they can be broken. And they can be broken thanks to policy, institutional, partnership, financial, technological innovations. And one of the key objectives of the 18th conference of the Alliance is to discuss one of the most needed innovations. Innovations in terms of partnership, broadening the partnerships, to eliminate trafficking in person. We know that when we think in terms of resources, we often think in terms of financial resources, human resources, seldom in terms of partnership. But actually partnership might be the most powerful instrument, the deepest type of resources that we have, through making sure that a given issue become a common issue for every single ministerial institution, making sure that we create partnership between civil society and between the public sector, between the private sector, civil society and the public sector. We will be able to create a framework to detect and prevent and respond to trafficking in person in a much more effective manner. We UN Women fully support and would like to applaud the decisions of the Alliance to focus its discussion during this conference on the idea of innovative partnership. On our side, we would like to make a plea for making sure that the association of survivors of trafficking in person are fully heard and brought into these partnerships. Their voice is critical in order to prevent and respond to trafficking in person. I would like to deeply thank you for your attention and wish you an extremely productive conference. Thank you very much.
Actually, all speakers stressed the importance of addressing the devastating abuses of human trafficking and sexual violence. And I am certain that the memorandum of understanding currently being developed between the OC and UN Women on key areas of cooperation will step up efforts to prevent these crimes and ensure complementarity of efforts. Next, I would like to introduce Unodc's Director for Treaty Affairs, Mr. John Brandolino, a great supporter of our Alliance Against Trafficking in Persons as a valuable platform to promote joint organizational efforts to support victims of human trafficking. Prior to joining the Unodc, Mr. Brandolino oversaw a wide portfolio of thematic areas at the U.S. State Department's Bureau for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs for 15 years. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Special Representative and Ambassador Jarbussynova, and for your commitment and the commitment of OSCE to this issue. Also, thank you to the Italian chairs and also the commitment of Italy, not only here at the OSCE, but in New York and elsewhere, to trafficking in persons, to addressing the issue. It's my pleasure to take part in this very timely 18th Alliance Conference to collectively address how we can promote closer links and synergies between all of our efforts in combating and preventing trafficking in persons. As some have mentioned, in recent years, the issue of trafficking in persons has, I think, quickly moved up the political agenda, particularly at the UN, thanks to attention it's received in the Security Council, the General Assembly, by special rapporteurs and representatives from other UN entities, some of which are here today, international, regional, and non-governmental organizations, and without a doubt, meetings such as the Alliance have helped to bring together varied actors and to progressively help us focus on the substantive aspects of addressing trafficking in persons. Also, the growing number of parties to the UN trafficking protocol, which is 173 at the moment, is also a clear expression of the political will. And as we all know, you can turn on the TV, turn on CNN, and you'll see that the issue has also increasingly caught the attention of the public, businesses, civil society, media, and celebrities who are appalled by this crime and want to act. If I may share, our experience in UNODC, we're, in addition to the normative work that we do, we're involved in capacity building on this issue in over 70 countries in the last year. So I just want to share for thought during the conference a couple of observations on our part, given our work. The first would be a high-level public commitment by a spectrum of stakeholders, which again, as I mentioned, we are definitely seeing, does not in itself translate into effective implementation on the ground or making a difference together on the ground. There is a need for all of us to coordinate and also to realize how we can work with each other in the most effective way. And then we hope that this conference will help address that issue. Second, states of origin, transit, and destination need to keep talking to each other. There still are obstacles that hamper international cooperation, particularly in criminal matters, including sovereignty issues, the diversity of law enforcement structures, the absence of enabling legislation, and limits of mechanisms for communication or exchange of information. Even though many governments have legislation in place, there is also a need to develop capacity to cooperate. That is a key part of turning this into action. Another point is interagency coordination at the national level is not only crucial to effective national action against transnational organized crime, but is also an important precondition for effective cross-border cooperation. So when we talk about bringing actors together, sometimes the actors are in our own government. They need to come together. It may be different organizations and parts of our government that need to cooperate. UNODC places a high priority on national coordination. Our model law on trafficking in persons proposes, as a best practice, the legislative establishment of a sustainable, multidisciplinary national coordinating body of both governmental and non-governmental agencies. Another point, practitioner-to-practitioner cooperation is key. We continue to observe that trafficking responses trafficking responses develop, actors become better at what they do, but often tend to operate in isolation from each other. So we need, for example, more cooperation between labor inspectorates and criminal justice investigators, more referrals from fringe actors to specialist functions, more sharing of practical experiences across borders. And also remember that when we talk about bringing actors together, it's not necessarily diverse actors that need to start communicating. It's sometimes actors within the same category. So we need investigators to start talking to investigators. We need prosecutors to start talking and sharing with prosecutors. Another point, of course, as has been said, civil society organizations are a crucial component of counter-trafficking responses. We need to better inform, mobilize, and learn from many of the frontline actors who have a high likelihood of interacting with victims. We should acknowledge and integrate these actors within a broader trafficking response, not only as grassroots providers of assistance to victims, but also in the setting of policy, the review of counter-trafficking activities, and the targeting of future priorities. As part of UNODC's broader civil society engagement, I'll mention the UN Voluntary Trust Fund for Victims of Trafficking in Persons, which currently includes 34 specialized NGOs, partners in 30 countries, who are awarded grants by the fund to provide diverse assistance and protection to trafficking victims worldwide. I couldn't go without making a plug for the fund, particularly to all the donors here. Similarly, another point, partnership with the private sector, of course, is essential to effectively addressing shared challenges. Businesses can stop human trafficking and forced labor from gaining a foothold in our communities and supply chains. They can advise governments. They can implement sound and humane practices in their own operations and mobilize much-needed resources to carry on for the fight for justice in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. And then finally, cooperation is also needed among the UN family and our partners. We have so many great agencies that are devoted to addressing trafficking in persons, and we all bring so many strengths to the table. The Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking in Persons, which is called ICAT, can help achieve this goal of making us more effective and coordinated in our work. As mandated by the General Assembly last year, Unodc, along with the chair of this year, Unicef, is convening the first ever meeting of heads of UN and other organizations, including the OSCE, on trafficking in persons on the 2nd of May, to give new impetus to the joint work and efforts of ICAT members. It will be the first principals meeting of ICAT in a long time, and hopefully will re-energize the group and move it forward in an effective way. In closing, we share the strong commitment of OSCE, as evidenced today of the Italian chair, to continue to bring together all types of actors relating to trafficking in persons and identify ways to benefit from their cooperation. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and we wish you the best of luck in the Alliance Day today. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for your presentation, for your good wishes. And I also would like to take this opportunity to thank your team for the good cooperation between my office and the unit on prevention of trafficking and smuggling. We have this good experience on data exchange, and also thank you for their contribution at the expert level to our projects in recent years. So I'd like to give the floor to UNICEF's Regional Director for Europe and Central Asia and Special Coordinator for Refugee and Migrant Response in Europe, to Mrs. Afshan Khan. She has more than 28 years of experience as in the international public service, inclusive, extensive field experience. And I'm also thankful as she contributed to our conference on public-private partnership in the fight against trafficking in human beings, which was co-organized by my office in Moscow in July 2017. The floor is yours, Mrs. Afshan.
Thank you, Ambassador Jarbussynova, distinguished panelists and delegates. It's a pleasure for me to represent UNICEF's Executive Director, Henrietta Fore, who shares her warm regards with all of the participants to the 18th Alliance Against Trafficking in Persons Conference. Human trafficking is not a new phenomenon in Europe, yet the recent refugee and migrant crisis has unquestionably boosted smugglers' business model by creating a ready pool of desperate clients. As we know, there's a thin and dangerous line between smugglers and traffickers. Those who start off using the services of smugglers often fall into the hands of traffickers once they're unable to meet their debts. Children, especially the unaccompanied, are easily manipulated in these circumstances and therefore the most exploitable victims. Some of the drivers that push children into this situation are the slow progress in EU relocation and family relocation schemes, and lack of access to other safe pathways is another major challenge. It drives children into the hands of smugglers and traffickers. For example, over the past 2 years, only about 11,000 children have been relocated from Greece and Italy, a fraction of those eligible. Resettlement, which remains the main sustainable legal pathway, is moving at a modest pace, with less than 39,000 people resettled to Europe over the last year. And according to UNHCR, there's still roughly 1.2 million refugees in need of resettlement worldwide. Reception conditions are overstretched and not adequate for children. Children stay too long in overcrowded centers without adequate child safeguards in place, and often with adults who are not relatives. This situation can lead to high psychological distress and interrupt children's development. Because the system is failing them, unaccompanied and separated children take matters into their own hands and slip through the cracks within that child protection system. Many of them resort to smugglers to reach families and countries of destination. The vast majority of all detected trafficking victims globally are women and children. Many of the people on the move to Europe over the last years have been resorting to smugglers and experience risk to trafficking, including for ransom, removal of organs, or forced labor and exploitation. Based on the IOM surveys amongst refugee and migrants arriving in Italy, 88% of the children versus 75% of adults responded positively to at least one question related to human trafficking and other exploitive practices. It's difficult to estimate how many children have lost their lives on the dangerous migration routes to North Africa while fleeing violence and insecurity. Yet we believe that at least 2,000 of the 12,000 fatalities at sea recorded in the Mediterranean were children. Between 2014 and 2017, over 1.8 million people entered Europe through the Mediterranean Sea, including more than 430,000 children. Over the past years, we've observed an increasing trend of children traveling alone. This is particularly true about the central Mediterranean route, where on average, 90% of all children are unaccompanied or separated. Between 2015 and 2017, some 60,000 unaccompanied and separated children arrived in Italy alone. Refugee and migrant children are at risk of trafficking even once in Europe, especially when they abscond from the formal reception system and go untraceable. Just in 2017, more than 11,700 children were reported missing from the reception system in Germany, Italy, and Greece. According to a recent Unicef IOM report entitled Harrowing Journeys, more than 2/3 of adolescent youth on the Central and Mediterranean route reported being held against their will, and just half of them reported being forced to work without pay. Many of them also described being held in jails and prisons and in collective housing organized by smugglers, principally in Libya. The region of origin of these children also matters. Evidence from the Central Mediterranean route, for example, shows that the likelihood of adolescents and young people to experience violence and abuse along their journey is 4 times higher if they come from sub-Saharan Africa compared to other regions. Through its response in Europe, UNICEF has identified effective mitigation measures to child trafficking. Examples include child rights monitoring, strengthened protection standards, and improved access to services, which would not have been possible without the collaborative effects of governments, UN agencies, civil society, and other partners. Boosting better data is crucial. In Greece, UNICEF has helped build a strong national child rights monitoring system under the leadership of the Greek ombudsperson to address significant evidence gaps regarding refugee and migrant children and to ensure national ownership and sustainability of this important work. In Italy, Greece, Germany, and Austria, UNICEF has worked on the improvement of protection standards and conditions in reception centers with government counterparts to keep children safe. To put the standards into practice, the German government has also funded the position of protection coordinators in 100 refugee centers, participating in this initiative nationwide, while UNICEF has developed training materials and tools to ensure the effective implementation and monitoring of standards. Over 2,500 refugee center managers, protection coordinators, and staff in the 100 centers in Germany have already been trained. Access to services is also key to reduce the risks of exploitation and trafficking. Between 2015 and 2017, UNICEF in Western Europe helped identify and refer over 30,000 children at risk and reached close to 200,000 children on the move and stranded with psychological support and other child protection services. Education in particular has appeared to be a key protective measure from trafficking. UNICEF is working with ministries of education on a strategic approach to the inclusion of refugee and migrant children into the formal education system. And UNICEF has worked with national authorities and ombudspersons to pilot volunteer guardianship and alternative care projects in Italy, which have the potential to be replicated and scaled up by national authorities to help ensure sustainability through improved child protection systems. The new law on the protection of foreign unaccompanied children in Italy, as was mentioned earlier, is considered one of the most progressive pieces of legislation in this area. And the EU communication of the European Commission on the protection of children in migration have been positive steps in guiding member states to address the rights and needs of all children on the move. Concerted advocacy efforts have helped countries to outlaw detention of unaccompanied and separated children on the move, and this is an important step forward and a good example of other countries to emulate. Children should never be detained because of their migration status. The Human Rights Council resolution on the protection of the rights of children in humanitarian situations, adopted in March 2018, reminds states of commitments towards ending migration detention of children. The essential partnerships have been referred to by several other speakers, so I'll only focus on a couple of key areas that can improve higher quality and higher impact. One is robust data and knowledge to ensure profiling and trafficking risk identification among unaccompanied children and separated children. UN agencies' partnership with national authorities was key, but also with civil society organizations, who in some situations are the only ones to reach out to the most at risk and most invisible children. For in-depth research and situation analysis, partnership with the academia is central, but cooperation with government entities to produce accessible administrative data and child-specific statistics disaggregated by age and sex is paramount. Coordinated or complementary joint programming interventions to plan and act on reliable information and mapping, and concerted resource mobilization and interagency partners with the UN is critical. Evolving practices, legal and social norms, partnerships are key to provide legal reform and evolving practices to protect the most vulnerable children to trafficking, children at risk of statelessness, children in migration detention, and finally, to address social norms that act as pull factors for children and related risks, we need to further engage in positive partnerships with media and corporate partners. UNICEF, therefore, has the following recommendations to effectively prevent and respond to trafficking of children. Provide safe and regular pathways, strengthen child protection systems, including data collection and dissemination, appoint guardians that provide child-friendly information and ensure access to legal aid, end the detention of children on the move, and prevent the criminalization of trafficked children for activities committed as a direct consequence of their exploitation. Offer children access to services and durable solutions that are built with the participation and engagement of young people. The next few days will be critical to building alliances and partnerships to deal with this issue, and I thank the OSCE for organizing this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Afshan, for your presentation and for the recommendations given by you. The figures you mentioned highlight the challenge facing us, while the recommendations you proposed are extremely relevant and I am sure will be followed during the discussions at our panels. Our next speaker is truly dedicated to the cause of refugees, having worked for UNHCR since 1986 in a variety of high-level capacities, duty stations, and emergency situations. The extensive work is also followed by his numerous, or exemplified by his numerous publications and contributions to the drafting of UNHCR training manuals relating to staff safety, emergency management, protection, and durable solutions. Many of us have heard him speaking at the OC Mediterranean Conference in Palermo, and it is a great pleasure for me to pass the floor to Mr. Vincent Cochetel, UNHCR's Special Envoy for the Central Mediterranean situation.
Thank you very much, Madam, and thank you very much for your invitation to share with you today some observation. Let me also use this opportunity to reiterate our commitment to the OSCE to participate in other simulation exercises on combating human trafficking along migration routes. I will not talk to you in details today about what we are doing to protect victims of trafficking along the central Mediterranean routes. Let me say just that it is often too late when people reach Libya. We cannot bring protection to victims of trafficking in Libya today. So we have to bring those victims to protection elsewhere. IOM, our partner, is returning people to their country of origin. That's part of the solution. For refugees, it's not a solution that is unfortunately not available. So we have to evacuate those refugees. We have evacuated some to Italy and many more to Niger. We will have, unfortunately, to stop this program in June because we do not have the resources anymore to run that program. It's difficult to speak after my colleague of UNICEF, and in the next 2 days there'll be a lot of speakers speaking more eloquently than me on the protection of victims of trafficking. So I will focus my observation on what I'm hearing from many politicians on both sides of the Mediterranean. I'm hearing that as a motto constantly: we need to defeat the business model of human traffickers. The title of this conference is about everyone has a role. So my question to you is, are we really doing what we are supposed to do? So let me allow me please to be frank, practical, even if I have to be a bit undiplomatic. I don't see any difference anymore on the routes leading to Libya between smugglers and traffickers. There is such a degree of coercion and violence that we are really talking about human trafficking. So the first proposal is not a new one. First, like for any form of trafficking, let's disrupt the supply of material used by traffickers. Chinese-made inflatable boats sold as unsinkable refugee boats by one online operator are still today exported to 2 OSCE countries. Those 2 OSCE countries allow private operators to use their port to re-export them to Libya. This is prohibited by the UN Security Council. This is prohibited by the Foreign Affairs Committee of the European Union. It's still happening. Only 5% of the cargoes are inspected, those cargoes destined to Libya today. There is no accountability requested to those 2 countries that have exported thousands of these boats to Libya since 2012. Those boats have killed more people than the war in Libya since 2012. Can you do something about prohibiting the online retailer that keeps advertising those products of death? My second proposal is about disrupting the supply of revenue to the human traffickers. Are we doing everything to follow the money flows? In OSCE countries, traffickers are often forcing migrants and refugees into prostitution and labor exploitative schemes. I won't name the country, I was recently in one OSCE country. I followed a bus That bus was dropping a woman every kilometer, a young woman from Cameroon, from Nigeria, to prostitute themselves in the open field. This is happening in broad daylight in some countries in the OSCE territory. Is this legal? The answer I'm getting, yes, prostitution is legal. But to determine whether it's legal, you need to talk to those women. Do you talk to those women? I've talked to those women. Do we want to see a link between human trafficking across the Mediterranean on what is being called by some legal prostitution, or we don't want to see that link? Money, supply of resources, lots of money is being done on those trafficking. The reduction of crossing around the Mediterranean means today that traffickers must find alternative ways to monetize their investment. That means, from what we hear from social media monitoring, that the price of ransom are gone up. And people caught in illegal detention center in Libya today are subject to several ransom by several actors. Payments are not made in Libya. Advertising is done through social media for payments to be made in various countries, including in Europe. So why don't we follow the money as if it was drug, as if it was arm export, as if it was terrorism? Timid progress has been done in Libya. The Attorney General has recently issued, 2 months ago, 205 warrants of arrest for human traffickers. Most of those people targeted by those warrants of arrest are government officials running immigration detention center, Libyan coast guards. None of those warrants of arrest have led to one arrest. It doesn't mean nothing can be done. Human traffickers in Libya and on the routes to Libya are not only used to transport people, they are involved in slavery practices. We did not need to wait for the CNN documentary a few months ago. This is known. It is not new, and it is not specific to Libya. It's happening in other countries neighboring Libya. We see people being rented out of detention center, sold out of detention center, leased out of detention center, and those militia directly involved in the trafficking or protecting human traffickers have over time diversified their portfolio. They are involved in weapon smuggling. Weapons are going back to Mali, unfortunately. They are involved in drug trafficking. They are involved in illegal trafficking of medicines. They are also trafficking smuggled oil out of Libya, depriving the Libyan states and Libyan people of resources they badly need. I'm sad to report that, unfortunately, boats with flags registered in OSCE countries are docking along the Libyan shore to buy that smuggled oil, therefore reinforcing the power of those militias involved in human trafficking. Third proposal here, fight impunity. My message today, to states mainly, is to talk less about defeating the business model of traffickers, but to do more and start putting an end to the cycle of impunity. Many traffickers are out of reach today, but you can prohibit them to travel. You can freeze their assets. You can stop playing politics at the Sanctions Committee of the UN and have more people named and listed. You can improve transnational police and judiciary cooperation. Then, and only then, we will start disrupting the business model of human traffickers. Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent, for your inspiring and emotional presentation. And I would like to thank UNHCR for the fantastic partnership we have been enjoying in putting together our life simulation exercises. Ladies and gentlemen, free and independent media are a cornerstone of democratic societies and the problems they face. At the OSCE, we believe that how subjects such as trafficking in human beings are reported by the journalists is how the public, private sector and states perceive and respond to it. And I'm convinced that better media reportage and the awareness and understanding that can be generated as a result has considerable potential to improve our overall response to contemporary forms of human trafficking. It is therefore a great pleasure for me to introduce our keynote speaker, Monique Villard, Chief Executive Officer of the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Since her appointment in 2008, the Thomson Reuters Foundation has created a number of high-impact programs, including Trust Conference, a fast-growing movement to fight slavery and empower women worldwide. Under Villa, the Thomson Reuters Foundation also covers the world's underreported stories and trains journalists to strengthen free media globally. As it was mentioned already by Paul, she has received the Champions for Change Award in 2015 for her vision and effort in the fight against human trafficking, and is also a recipient of ECPAT USA's inaugural Freedom Award in 2017 in recognition of her leadership in the fight to end child trafficking. We are extremely delighted to have you here today with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madina. If you don't mind, I will stand up because I prefer to speak, standing up to see everybody. And I see many friends in the room, and it's a pleasure. I don't know if you know all of the countries in the world, more than 190 countries in the world, how much they spend to fight human trafficking every year. All together. Not even $1 billion. And the lion's share is the US, from very far. It just shows that to combat a scourge that my compatriot was describing so well in Libya, we spend just a drop of water in an ocean of corruption. And so I think it is really good to see the OSCE empower themselves to try to fight human trafficking, because we need you. I was having breakfast on Saturday morning, and suddenly I saw the front page of the Times. The headline was, "Child Slave Gangs Go Free." And the article, I highlighted that only 6% of the crimes recorded by police under the Modern Slavery Act of 2015 in the UK are just escaping completely justice. Kevin Ireland, who is the independent UK commissioner and who is here today with us, always say that officially in the UK there are 13,000 slaves, but it is only the tip of the iceberg because there are many, many more. So if there are so many slaves in the UK, it means that there are probably as many in France, in Italy, and elsewhere, and probably more in Italy with the massive migration. You know, it's good to see the press now speaking almost on a daily basis of slavery. But if you rewind 10 years back, it didn't exist at all. Even 5 years ago, it was unthinkable. Nobody was thinking of slavery as something that happened in our countries all over the world. It was not in the public domain, and it was not perceived by governments, corporations, or civil society as the most monstrous of crime, which is to say to treat a human being as a commodity and deprive him of all his rights. But today things are changing, so what's happening? So one thing, as you were saying, Madina, is the media attention on this crime that has been absolutely crucial, because We will see later why, but from the moment that media got interested into the issue, then, you know, government have to be interested, etc. So this is going to increase and not diminish in the next few years, and the TR Foundation that I run has played quite a big role in that field, because we have to expose the situation as it is and not as we would like it to be. And this is what we do on a daily basis, and you can read our news on trust.org. And very soon, we are going to add 5 journalists covering on a daily basis slavery and trafficking in 5 more countries, namely Mexico, Brazil, Cambodia, Bangladesh, and Thailand. We are already covering on a daily basis from the UK what happens in Europe, and from India what happens in India. I have 2 journalists in India covering only human trafficking and slavery, and as we all know, India is the biggest country for slaves in the world, followed by China. Second, we are starting to work together, and by doing so, we are beginning to achieve impact. And I know this approach works because I have first-hand experience in. I am running the foundation since 10 years, and as you say, I created new programs, and all these programs are created to empower people and to help the best partnership happen and deliver results. So for the fight on human trafficking and slavery, it is good when we work in sync and not in silos, and this is when we achieve real progress. Slavery, as many have said, is a multifaceted and very fast-growing crime. It is a silent crime. A victim cannot shoot out for help. Slaves have no voice. Slaves have no vote, more importantly. And if they had vote, probably, as it is a country as big as Algeria today, 40 million slaves in the world, we would hear them, but we don't. So it flourishes where corruption is widespread, where people are vulnerable, where kids don't have a future, and where those exploited do not know their rights. So educate kids, as many said here, to know their rights is fundamental. And I've seen that firsthand in India. It's a crime without borders, preying on the weakest and the displaced. The world is experiencing the biggest movement of people since World War II, as we were speaking before. And more than 22 million people have been displaced from their countries in the last few years. People desperate to keep their children sheltered, fed, and alive, and so ready to fall prey to traffickers who are just looking at that. It is vulnerability and desperation that turns people into slaves. It is silence and ignorance around the crime that keep them in that vicious cycle. And of course, the total impunity for slavers, and when I say total impunity, it's real. It is no danger of being taken and put in jail. I think that in the last year, there were only 9,000 prosecutions in the entire world for 40.3 million slaves in the world, according to the ILO, which is always very conservative, as we know. So the vulnerability and the silence make that, and the impunity, make that the biggest business is under our eyes, and we don't do enough. So according, again, to the ILO, it is a business of $150 billion a year, pure profit. According to most specialists around the world, it's a lot more than $150 billion. It's probably $1 trillion if we can imagine what it is. And now, in the digital age, the industry is massively moving online. It is very easy to sell, to put the people traffic from the streets to the internet, where you can sell and resell women and children forever. This is organized crime at its best, and as I was saying, we fight in a very disorganized manner, and this is, of course, the chance of the slavers. Therefore, if we want to stand a chance at winning this battle, we have to work together more and more and in a more organized manner. To truly disrupt these networks, we need to be one step ahead of the perpetrators, and we are currently lagging far behind, always reacting and always late reacting. To get there, we need to act together. At the Thomson Reuters Foundation, we bring our main programs together and partner with others, corporates, prosecutors, organizations in the front lines, philanthropists, and government to accelerate and scale impact. Let's start with our news. You said we covered the underreported story, and human trafficking 8 years ago when we started to cover it was totally underreported. So we cover the issue on a daily basis, and our stories are published all over the world by news outlets because we are distributed on the Reuters Wise, so a potential audience of 1 billion people a day. When we started, we were one of the very few to do this. Namely, you had The Guardian and you had a few others who were really dedicating time to show the dimension of the issue. We did 2 years ago, just an example, we did 2 years ago an investigation on what happens in the mica mines in India, where children are dying and not paid, and children as young as 5 years old, because mica is a very friable mineral, and to get it, it's easier to have very small hands. So many children work in that industry. Mica is the thing with which we do all our cosmetics, painting of our cars, paintings of our iPhones, etc. So it is used massively by all the industries. 60% of the production comes from India. So we showed and exemplified how children were slaves in mica mines. 3 months after, Volkswagen, which is the biggest car maker, announced that they were reviewing all their contracts with Indian suppliers in the region of Jharkhand, where we were, to see if there were really cases of slavery and finish that. This is what I call impact. News can have impact when they are serious, balanced, and accurate. The government of India had to implement an investigation after that. I don't say it has given great results 1 year after. We went back and nothing had really changed. But anyway, we try, and we will try more. Trafficking is a very difficult crime to cover accurately because you are heading directly with people who really make a lot of money out of it, and these are gangs. So it requires skills ranging from investigative reporting to a deep understanding of defamation, of privacy laws, and the risks that the victims can face if exposed. So we have decided years ago to start to train journalists on how to cover these issues in different countries. So we do that in India. We have done that massively in Africa. We do that everywhere we are asked because we need more journalists investigating. We also help all the NGOs in the front line in the fight against trafficking because we cover all their legal needs for free. This is trust law. This is a pro bono legal program that we created in 2010 at the Foundation. And just for slavery and trafficking, we have more than 130 NGOs in the front line. The moment they are members, we take over all their legal needs, and they don't have to pay. For the 800 law firms who work for free in this network, which is the biggest in the world, to help NGO. In the first 7 years of trust law, law firms have told us that they have spent $109 million of brain time of their lawyers for the NGOs they support and the social entrepreneurs they support through trust law. So big impact there also. We have through this program, for instance, helped transform the law in the Philippines on domestic labor. in Asia, domestic workers are very often almost on the verge of slavery. And an NGO wanted to have the law changed in the Philippines, Visayan Forum, and we helped them through White & Case and a number of law firms around the world look at what would be the best law and regulations in the Philippines. The law was voted. It transformed the life literally of 2 million workers in the Philippines. Today, it is still the best law in Asia for domestic workers. So partnership is absolutely key. Trust law is all about putting together partners with different knowledge and capacity to take action together. And if we want to get scale, we need to do more partnerships. All kinds of different players come to our Trust Conference, for instance, in London, every year to take action on trafficking. This year, we will have it on 14 and 15 November at the Queen Elizabeth Centre in London. This is a place where strategic and non-traditional alliances are born. And I will speak of a very few of them, but this is a place where business meets civil society, where law enforcement meets the tech industry, where bankers connect with frontline activists to combine their skills as a force for good. We give a platform to remarkable individuals or organizations who need help to implement good initiatives. We have implemented many actions as Jobs for Survivors and many, many others. The first big one we implemented was the Bankers Alliance. We were speaking just before of how you should follow data and follow the money. This was exactly that. It was launched in 2014. And I launched it with the Manhattan District Attorney, Cyrus Vance, in New York. And because traffickers, like all of us, use credit card data to transfer and launder illegal profits. And while they do so, they leave a trail of financial data that can be used to identify and disrupt their work, and which can provide vital evidence needed to prosecute them. The Bankers Alliance is a multi-stakeholder working group which was established first in the US, but then in Europe, and now in Asia, and it brings together banks, NGOs, law enforcement, and the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Last year, we published a toolkit with a set of red flags. So the banks incorporate in their software the red flags that we have prepared with the best NGOs to show when, if tens of red flags show up, it means it's probably a case of human trafficking, and they can share with law enforcement. This was done in Europe in 2017, and immediately the Wolfsburg group of the 15 biggest banks in the world adopted the toolkit of the Thomson Reuters Foundation and asked all the banks in the world to adopt it to help the prosecutors to prosecute slavers on data and not only on the strengths of the victim. And as we know, victims are so much abused that it's sometimes very difficult to have that. So 2 years ago, we also helped an NGO called Legal Momentum. It's an American NGO fighting a series of legal loopholes which allowed websites such as Backpage.com to sell human beings online. Working with the law firm Oric through Trust Law, Legal Momentum launched a huge and fierce campaign at all levels of society in the US. And these past months, both the House of Representatives and the Senate in the US have voted a law to allow sex trafficking victims to pursue the website that facilitate the business of the traffickers. Immediately after, Backpage.com CEO was arrested, and he has been accused of pimping, and now is pleading guilty of human trafficking after refusing for years to stop selling children and women on his website. Many, many other websites are doing the same, and they should be addressed in the same manner. The biggest opposition in the US to that law, guess who it was? It was Google and the giant of Silicon Valley under the fake pretext of freedom of speech. as if it was the same thing, freedom of speech and selling people on the internet and children on the internet. So this is very positive, but a lot more remains to be done. And the first issue to address is data. Some of us spoke of that, but it's very important. We have 40.3 million slaves according to ILO. All the specialists think it's a lot more and more in the 100 million. When you know well India, as I do, you really think it's even more than 100 million. And we have no idea. We think that 30% of all trafficking is in sex trafficking and 70% in forced labor. And forced labor is essentially in the supply chain of all our corporations worldwide. So how can we fight slavery effectively if we don't even know the number of slaves, if we don't know the dimension of the issue, if we don't know if we are making progress or worse? So human trafficking is fast growing. The Ethical Trade Initiative highlights recently that 71% of the products manufactured by the retail, beverage, and personal care industries are likely to be tainted with forced labor, 71%. Indeed, no business today, including Thomson Reuters Corporation, can say, I am slavery-free. But they can start to look at their supply chains and see what happens there. It's not easy because supply chains have become incredibly cumbersome, but it is something that they have to do. And legislation has forced them to start to pay attention to the issue, starting with the UK Anti-Slavery Act, then the French Duty of Act Care in 2017, or the Netherlands Child Labour Due Diligence in 2017. And now Australia and the Bali group are going also to vote laws regarding that. So all this has started to raise the attention of the CEOs on the issue of forced labor in their supply chain. And this is progress. But government policy takes a long time to implement, as we know, and sometimes lack teeth, simply. And this is where the power of cross-sector partnership comes. So we have engaged considerably the business sector into this fight. And we have launched in 2016, the Thomson Reuters Foundation and Anish Kapoor, the artist, the great artist, we have launched together the Stop Slavery Award. We give the Stop Slavery Award to corporations which are best in class to try to clean their supply chain from forced labor. And I repeat, try to clean their supply chain from forced labor. Once again, they are not slave-free. And it was really interesting to see, so at the jury, the very independent jury that judged the companies which are candidates for this award is done of John Ruggie, who designed the UN business principles and human rights, Kailash Satyarthi with the Nobel Prize for Slavery, Cyrus Vance, Kevin Ireland, and Ken Ross with the director of Human Rights Watch. Together, we look at the quality of the candidates, and in the first year, you had companies like Apple, like Tesco, like M&S, who were candidates. They didn't win. It was HP, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise and NXP Semiconductors who won. Last year, we had many more candidates, and Adidas was the overall winner for both years. Adidas is a German corporation that puts so much effort into trying to know their supply chain and cleaning it. They know every supplier in tier 2 of their supply chain. This doesn't exist for other corporations. So they are really an example for everybody. But we had more winners like Intel, the Cooperative Group, and CNA, all very big brand and consumers brand. And the goal is to make of the Stop Slavery Award something that the consumer will look at before buying, because we all have a responsibility as human beings on the goods we choose. So if we can know that some companies pay more attention to this issue than others, we should follow them. Okay, so now I will just close this discussion, and we can see significant steps in the right direction, but just what we just heard on what is happening every day in Libya, and knowing that in Libya, all of us, European governments, we now ask them to keep the refugees there and not to move them to Europe. We know what happens in Libya. So it is a terrible thing that we are doing, and we know we do it knowingly. So this is really a very big issue. We understanding just what partners can bring to the table to complement our own expertise has been vital for me to maintain the powerful connection and achieve impact. And we achieve impact. So only together we can start to stop slavery and start to achieve impact. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank Monique for her inspiring presentation and for her firm commitment in the fight against trafficking in human beings. And we look forward to the tomorrow's side event on the role of media in combating trafficking in human beings, and to the continued cooperation between the OC and the foundation. Well, I was going to briefly introduce our today agenda, but given that we are behind the schedule, and also given that you have the annotated agenda before you, and there is a description of the first of the two panels, actually the first one which will start after this welcoming panel. Tomorrow in the morning there'll be the second panel, and after the second panel, we are inviting you to attend 4 side events co-organized with our partners. I want already to thank those who organized our 3 side events, which took place already before the opening of the alliance. So they are giving additional platform to exchange information and for the discussion. And I would like to thank those who already organized today's side event, ODIHR and TNTD colleagues from SPMU, the delegation of Belarus, and also 3 delegations of Greece, France and Belgium for the side event, which will be tomorrow, and also La Strada International for the organization of the side event to discuss the importance of compensation. So I would like to thank all our welcoming panelists and keynote speaker for this inspiration towards the following discussions at our panels. And I would like to close this welcoming event by mentioning that finally 50 years after the untimely death of Martin Luther King, I would like to use his metaphorical yet extremely apt warning that our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. Actually, many of the panelists spoke today about the importance of us not being tolerant, not being silent towards the abuses of human rights. So, as many of you have gathered here today to mitigate the destructive practice of trafficking, ladies and gentlemen, I believe is testament to the fact that fight against trafficking matters now more than ever. And I would like to thank each and every one of you therefore for this involvement, and ask to do your utmost over the next 2 days to allow us to make a significant contribution to the fight and also to continue fighting trafficking in human beings. Now I declare the welcoming part closed, and I would like to say that as actually we should be already at the beginning of our first panel, just let's break for 15 minutes and be in this room in 15 minutes to start our first panel discussion. Yeah.